Chapter 1. The Forbidden Shrine. Kyoto, Japan, spring 1998. It had been raining for hours. A soft, endless drizzle fell over the ancient city, soaking narrow alleys and worn stone steps, wrapping Kyoto in a heavy gray silence. The usual buzz of tourists had vanished with the storm. In the dim back room of an aging apartment complex above a ramen shop, 5 students huddled in the glow of a flickering laptop screen. Makoto leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes glued to the pixelated footage. He paused the video and tapped the spacebar. "There," he said. "That's it." The image on screen was barely visible. Blurred shapes, dim light, trees stretching endlessly in all directions. But in the center of the frame stood a torii gate, its red paint faded and streaked with dark stains. Behind it, obscured by creeping vines and the skeletal limbs of ancient trees, loomed a shrine. Aika, seated quietly in the corner, tilted her head. Her long black hair hung like a curtain around her pale face. "That mask," she whispered. "What?" said Yuki, glancing back at her. Aika didn't look up. Her voice was distant, as if coming from somewhere far away. "I saw that mask once, in my grandmother's attic, wrapped in rice paper. It looked exactly like that." On the screen, the camera moved closer to the torii gate. The red pillars were chipped, covered in strange, dark smudges. Moss clung to every surface. At the base of the gate, the ground was disturbed, like something had been buried and dug up again. Makoto clicked pause again, freezing the image. In the shadows just behind the gate, a blurred figure could be seen. Not clearly, just a vague shape, but unmistakably human. "People call it Kuchisake Jinja," he said. "No one knows who built it. No priests, no offerings. It's not on any map. They say it shows itself only to those it chooses." Kenta rolled his eyes. "So what? It's a ghost temple. It's tied to the legend of the slit-mouthed woman," Makoto replied, almost proudly. "But older, more violent. Some people think she wasn't just a spirit, that she was real, and that shrine is where she was buried." Yuki, always chasing online fame, lifted her camcorder. "Perfect content. I mean, if it's real, we'll be famous. And if it's not, we'll fake it. Either way, we win." Taro, the quietest of the group, frowned slightly. "I don't know. I've heard stories about people going to shrines that don't exist on the map. Most of them don't come back. Urban legends," Kenta muttered. But no one laughed. Then the video skipped. A frame glitched, and for a split second, a face appeared on the screen. White skin, black hair, a mouth torn open from ear to ear. Yuki gasped. "Did you see that?" Makoto clicked back, but the frame was gone. Only trees now, just trees. The next morning, the 5 of them left the city and took the train toward the mountains. They carried backpacks filled with flashlights, snacks, cameras. And in Makoto's case, a printed map he found on a cursed forum thread that hadn't been updated in years. They got off at a half-abandoned station, walked past rice paddies, and entered a forest where the sun barely reached the ground. The air was heavy, moist. It wasn't long before the path disappeared. Still, they pressed on. Birdsong faded. The wind died. the buzzing of insects vanished, replaced by the soft crunch of moss underfoot and the increasingly shallow sound of their own breathing. Aika stopped and turned to a nearby tree. She placed her hand on the bark. Beneath her fingers, she felt a long groove, cold, deep, shaped like a mouth. She withdrew her hand. It was damp with something thicker than rain. Yuki, a few steps ahead, suddenly froze. Guys, through the mist, between two leaning cedar trees, stood the torii gate. Its paint was no longer faded red. It was deep crimson, sticky, wet. No one spoke. They stepped under the gate in silence. The shrine was barely standing. Its roof sagged inward, covered in mold. The wooden steps were cracked, leading to an entrance with no door, only darkness inside. As they crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped. Inside, the shrine was filled with dust and the sharp smell of mildew. Paper talismans, torn and rotting, clung to the walls. Wooden statues, their eyes gouged out, lined the edges of the room. In the center stood an altar, and on that altar was the mask. White porcelain, smooth and blank, except for the grotesque, jagged slash from one corner of the mouth to the other. It was smiling. Aika stepped forward. "Aika, don't," Makoto said, but she didn't stop. She reached out. Her fingers touched the mask, and she inhaled sharply. A thin stream of blood trickled from her nose. It slid down to her upper lip, unnoticed. Her eyes locked with the hollow sockets of the mask. Something in her changed. On the way back through the forest, the atmosphere had shifted. None of them spoke. The air felt thick, oppressive. Their flashlights flickered despite fresh batteries. Yuki tried to review the footage she'd recorded, but her screen showed nothing but static. She scrolled through the photos. Blank. Every image was black. "All gone," she whispered. "I filmed everything. I swear I did." Kenta grabbed the camcorder, checked the files. "No way. It's all gone. Nothing. Not even a second of audio." Taro, lagging behind, suddenly stopped walking. He turned and looked back. There, just beyond the torii gate, barely visible through the mist, stood a woman in a white kimono, her hair covering her face. She wasn't standing. She was hanging upside down from a branch, not swaying, not moving, just hanging, staring. Taro's lips parted, but no words came out. He looked at Aika. She smiled, not the smile they knew. It was wrong. A curve of the lips too wide, too deliberate, too empty. She turned her gaze forward again and kept walking. Chapter 2. Something follows. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained bruised and overcast, as if the sun had forgotten to rise. Back in the city, everything felt off. The 5 friends said nothing on the train ride home. No jokes, no retelling of what happened. They didn't even look at one another. Each sat in their own silence, eyes lost in the blur of the passing landscape, as if waking from a shared nightmare they couldn't fully explain or escape. Aika sat by the window. Her reflection didn't match her. It blinked slower, smiled when she wasn't. She didn't seem to notice. By the time they reached the apartment, a strange weight had settled in the air. It pressed against the walls, crawled through the vents, soaked into the floorboards. Something unseen, but real, heavy. Makoto opened the fridge. Every bottle inside had spoiled. Milk curdled, eggs gray. They had been fine that morning. Must have been the power, he muttered. But the lights hadn't flickered. The clocks hadn't reset. Meanwhile, Kenta sat scrolling through online forums, trying to find the original thread with the shrine's location. But the page was gone. 404. Thread deleted. He checked the user's profile. Account doesn't exist. How's that even possible? He muttered. I just downloaded it 3 days ago. Yuki, in her room, replayed the footage for the 10th time. Still nothing. Static. Audio hiss. She tried recovering deleted files, but each restored clip was blank. Except one. A 3-second fragment. No name. No thumbnail. She clicked play. The screen lit up with red. A face filled the frame. A mask. No, not a mask. A woman's face. Mouth gaping unnaturally wide. Teeth sharp and cracked. Her jaw hanging at an impossible angle. She whispered one word. Aika's name. Then it cut to black. That night, the dreams began. Makoto dreamed of a forest that breathed. Trees pulsed like lungs. The sky above the canopy was blood red, and every step he took was muffled, as if walking through flesh. In the distance, he heard laughter, high, broken, and wet. He awoke gasping, his sheets soaked. His fingernails were filled with dirt. Kenta dreamed of a shrine, the same one. He stood before it, unable to move, as a woman in white crawled out from behind the altar on all fours. Her limbs were too long. Her hands were bleeding. Her face was covered by a cracked porcelain mask. She whispered in his ear, "You saw me. Now I see you." He didn't sleep again that night, but it was Aika who changed the most. She no longer blinked as often. Her appetite vanished. She stood by windows for long stretches of time, staring at nothing. Her phone rang once in the middle of the night. She didn't answer, but afterward, she sat on her bed with her head tilted, listening to something no one else could hear. She began humming, a low, tuneless sound, over and over, always the same notes. And every night, after she hummed, the apartment would go cold. Doors creaked, the bathroom light would flicker. And on more than one occasion, Yuki swore she saw a shadow in the hallway mirror, standing just behind Aika, smiling. On the third night, Taro snapped. "I'm done," he said, stuffing clothes into his backpack. "This isn't a joke anymore. Something came back with us. Something's wrong with her, and we're all pretending it's fine." "No one's pretending anything," Yuki said quietly. "She watches me sleep," Taro said, eyes wide. "Do you hear me? She stands outside my room. I've seen her, just standing there. She doesn't knock. She doesn't move. She just listens." Makoto tried to stop him, but Taro was already at the door. He didn't look back. That night, Taro didn't make it home. His phone pinged a final message to the group chat at 2:13 a.m. Just a single word. Gate. They tried calling. No answer. They checked his location. No signal. Makoto, shaking, opened the photo Yuki had taken from the original shrine video. The one she thought had deleted itself. It was back on her phone, but it wasn't the same. Now, in the center of the frame, under the Torai gate, hung a body. Upside down. It was Taro. Chapter 3, Aika's Smile. The apartment felt different after Taro's disappearance. It wasn't just quieter, it was emptier, as though the space he had once occupied had been hollowed out, consumed. There were no police, no news alerts, no search parties. It was as if the world had decided he never existed. Only his shoes by the door remained. Makoto stared at them for a long time the next morning. They weren't there last night, he muttered. No one answered. Yuki hadn't spoken since 2:13 a.m. And since that final message, Gate. She sat curled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, eyes red from crying. But what frightened Makoto more was that she wasn't crying anymore, just staring. Her camera, normally clutched in her hand, now lay untouched. It had been recording all night on accident. Makoto reviewed the footage later. Hours of nothing. Until 3:07 a.m. He paused, pressed play. A figure appeared in the corner of the room, and still, silent, wearing white, hair covering her face. She didn't move, didn't blink. She stood inches from Yuki while she slept. Makoto slammed the laptop shut. Meanwhile, Aika grew stranger by the hour. She no longer answered to her name. When spoken to, she turned her head with a soft crick, like a doll being wound too tightly. She had begun sketching in a journal, page after page filled with the same image. A smiling woman with a mouth cut wide open, lips stitched at the corners. Some drawings were childlike, others were hyper-realistic, as though she had traced a photo taken in secret. None of them had eyes, and yet, all of them stared. Makoto caught her humming again, low and rhythmic, hypnotic, the same melody each time. It always ended with 3 sharp notes, like a warning or a knock. Kenta tried burning one of the drawings, just one. The flames hissed violently, like a scream, and the paper twisted unnaturally in the fire, curling into the shape of a mouth before crumbling. That night, he woke up choking. Aika was standing over him. She held one of the drawings in her hand. "It's rude," she said softly, "to burn her face." By the 4th day, the apartment had changed entirely. The mirrors no longer reflected correctly. They lagged, as if replaying events a few seconds late. Sometimes, when they passed a mirror, it didn't show them at all. Just a red torii gate, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. The walls were slick with condensation. The lights buzzed constantly. Doors opened on their own. They would wake to find wet footprints on the floor, leading from the bathroom to Aika's room, even when she hadn't left her bed. Makoto tried to confront her. "Aika," he said, standing in her doorway. "You have to tell us what's going on." She sat on the floor, back to him, head tilted, still sketching. "You brought her back," she said, without turning around. "We all did, but I'm the only one she chose." Makoto swallowed hard. "Who is she?" Aika stopped drawing. Then slowly, mechanically, she turned her head. "She's the smile beneath your skin," she whispered. That evening, Makoto decided to sleep in the living room, keeping the lights on. Yuki joined him without asking. Neither spoke. They both knew the silence was safer. At 3:12 a.m., the television turned on by itself. A static-filled screen blinked into life. Then a voice, soft, feminine, wet. "Smile for me." Makoto grabbed the remote. Nothing worked. The screen shook as if hands pressed against the inside. The image changed. It showed the shrine, but it wasn't a video. It was live. The trees swayed. The Toria gate bled. A woman stood in front of the altar, motionless. As they watched, she slowly turned her head, as if looking through the screen. At them, Yuki screamed. The TV exploded, showering sparks across the room. Smoke poured out, but the wires weren't burned. Makoto had had enough. The next morning, he packed a bag. "We have to go back," he said, "to the shrine. Whatever this is, whatever we brought back, it started there. It ends there." Yuki didn't answer, but she nodded. They turned to Aika. She was sitting in the hallway, humming, drawing on the walls with red ink that smelled of iron. When Makoto approached her, she finally looked up. This time, she smiled. Her lips stretched too far. The skin at the corners had begun to crack, bleeding. "Bring me home," she said. "I miss the trees." Chapter 4. The Return. The path back to the shrine felt longer than they remembered. Trees leaned inward, as if listening. The sky above, veiled by twisted branches, let in little light, casting the trail into a permanent twilight. Every step crunched against the damp earth and brittle twigs, but none of them spoke. There was something sacred in the silence, something ominous. Makoto led the way, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, though it flickered as if unsure whether to keep burning. Beside him, Aika clutched the charm she'd taken from her grandmother's altar, a slip of red paper folded so many times it looked like a withered petal. Kenta trailed behind, visibly uneasy, his eyes darting into the woods every few steps. And Yuki, always the documentarian, held her camera low, not filming, not yet. When they reached the clearing, the shrine waited for them like a wound in the world. The Torii gate was still there, its once vibrant vermilion, now sun-bleached and chipped. But more than that, it felt aware of them. As they stepped under it, each one unconsciously held their breath. The forest behind them fell away like a memory. In front of them stood the shrine, ancient and waiting. The shrine itself had decayed further. Moss grew thick on its stone base, and the wooden pillars bent in unnatural angles. Shimenawa ropes, blackened with mold, swayed though there was no wind. Aika walked forward with slow reverence, muttering softly in a dialect none of them recognized. The ground beneath her seemed to respond. Small, almost imperceptible tremors followed her steps. Makoto followed, then the others. When they crossed into the shadow of the structure, the air changed. It grew colder, sharper, like they had stepped underwater. Inside, everything was wrong. The shrine was small, but impossibly dark. A lantern still hung from one corner, somehow lit, its flame wavering violently as though terrified. The walls were etched with symbols that hadn't been there before. Circles filled with inked teeth, mouths with too many tongues, painted in red that glistened glistened like fresh blood. At the center stood the altar. It was littered with old offerings, dolls with glassy eyes, bones tied with crimson threads, a mirror that was cracked but reflected perfectly. Aika approached it and removed the doll she'd brought, a family heirloom, and placed it gently on the shrine. She whispered something no one could hear, and as she did, her shoulders tensed as if resisting a scream. Suddenly, Yuki gasped. She had been filming again. On her small screen, shapes moved behind them. Figures, dozens of them, pale, eyeless, featureless, except for mouths stretched unnaturally wide, dripping something dark. But when she looked directly, nothing, only shadows. "I saw them," she whispered. "I still see them." Makoto spun around, flashlight casting strange shapes onto the walls, but the beam sputtered and died. Then came the sound, a clicking, fast and wet, like bones being sucked into sockets. It echoed through the shrine, rising in pitch, then silence, then a voice, soft, feminine, broken. "You came back." From the far corner, something moved, slowly, dragging itself forward. A woman emerged, or what had once been one. Her limbs were bent the wrong way, her neck twisted, and her mouth, it stretched from ear to ear, lips torn and stitched in places, teeth too white, too long. Her eyes were weeping black. Kenta screamed and stumbled back, knocking over a stone urn. Ash burst into the air like breath from the dead. "Stay calm," Aika whispered. "She remembers us." Makoto stepped in front of Aika, protective instinct overriding terror. "What do you want from us?" he demanded. The creature smiled. "You took my voice. Now you give it back." Aika fell to her knees, her face twisted with pain. The charm in her hand caught fire, silent, smokeless flame that consumed it instantly. She began chanting in a harsh, guttural rhythm. The woman began to twitch, glitching between shadows, her form vibrating with each word. The shrine trembled. The walls began to bleed, not metaphorically. Thick red liquid oozed from the carvings, spelling out names, their names, over and over. Makoto, Aika, Yuki, Kenta. Yuki's camera sparked and died. "She's not angry," Aika gasped. "She's hungry. She was locked away here, silenced, sacrificed, and we brought her memory back." The ghost's head tilted, the joints in her neck cracking like dry wood. Then she lunged, not toward Aika, but toward the altar. She melted into the mirror, her scream trapped in its surface like a recording. The flame in the lantern died. The shrine fell into pure darkness. They ran. No one spoke as they tore through the woods. The forest, alive with whispers, seemed to push them out. As they emerged past the Torii gate, they collapsed to the ground, gasping. The sun had risen behind a thick mist. They looked back. The Torii gate was gone. So was the path. The shrine had sealed itself once more. Chapter 5. Echoes in the Mist. They didn't speak on the train ride home. Aika stared out the window, her eyes unfocused, watching the trees blur past in a fog that refused to lift. Kenta sat slouched in his seat, headphones in, but no music playing. His hands trembled as if trying to forget how it felt to see something not meant for the living. Yuki held her broken camera like it was a relic, her thumb idly brushing the cracked screen, as though hoping it might turn back on and explain everything. Makoto, ever the rational one, had tried twice to speak, but failed each time. His voice caught in his throat like a name he couldn't say. When they reached Tokyo, the city looked off. The colors seemed muted, like an old photograph. Traffic lights glowed dull red. Pedestrians moved too slowly. Even the sound of the city, the constant hum of life, felt hollow, like everything was happening behind glass. They each said brief goodbyes, promising to meet again, to talk things through. But the moment they parted ways, a heavy silence wrapped around each of them, a weight that followed them all the way home. That night, Aika dreamed. She stood before the shrine again, though it was no longer hidden in the forest. It stood in the middle of a vast, empty city, surrounded by buildings that stretched to the sky, but had no windows, no doors. Inside the shrine, the woman waited, her mouth bleeding endlessly onto the floor. "You gave me a voice," she said, her voice echoing like 1,000 whispering mouths. "Now I'll speak through you." Aiko awoke screaming, her sheets soaked in sweat, her hands covered in symbols drawn in blood, symbols she didn't remember carving. Kenta's phone rang at 3:03 a.m. He answered without thinking. On the other end was a voice, his own voice, crying. He tried to hang up, but the screen had frozen. The crying got louder, more distorted. Then a whisper. "You watched, now you'll listen." The call ended. His phone screen shattered in his hand, leaving a bloody cut across his palm. Yuki reviewed the footage. She had taken the memory card out before the camera died. At first, it was all static and glitching, just digital artifacts. But then she saw it. A frame. Just one, where the ghost woman looked directly into the lens. Her face took up the whole screen. Her mouth moved. Yuki paused, rewound, played it again. Her lips formed a sentence. "Let me in." The lights in Yuki's apartment flickered. Her reflection in the dark TV screen didn't move with her. It smiled. Makoto heard a knock at his door. 3 soft taps, like fingernails on wood. He looked through the peephole. No one. Another knock. 3 again. He opened the door slowly, cautiously. On the floor was an envelope, sealed with wax the same color as blood. No name, no stamp. Just a symbol, a mouth drawn in red ink, wide and grinning. He didn't open it, but that night, the letter was inside his fridge, then in his bathroom cabinet, then under his pillow. It was following him. Over the next few days, things worsened. Mirrors no longer showed their reflections at the right angles. Voices called out to them in crowds, always familiar, always wrong. They dreamed of the shrine every night. In each dream, it was closer, not in the woods anymore. It was here, in the city, hidden in alleys, behind closed shops, beneath train platforms. And the woman, her mouth wider than ever, spoke louder. "You brought me back. You opened the gate. Now I walk among you." Chapter 6. Through the mouth of the city. It started with echoes, small ones, just barely noticeable. Footsteps behind them that didn't belong to anyone. their names whispered on empty train platforms, flickers of movement in the reflections of passing windows. At first, each of them thought it was the trauma, the shared horror of the shrine resurfacing in their minds. But within days, those quiet echoes became something louder, something real. Makoto noticed it first. He was walking home from work late one evening, the streets unusually deserted. Tokyo was never silent, not even at 2 a.m. There were always taxi horns, blinking crosswalk signals, late-night laughter from izakayas. But that night, there was only the sound of his own breathing, and then something else. Click, 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 like fingernails tapping on wood. He stopped under a flickering street lamp and turned. No one behind him. Then, ahead, what should have been a narrow alley leading to a convenience store, stood a torii gate, just like the one at the shrine. Old, rotten, crimson paint faded to a sickly pink in places. But this one was new in its placement. It had never been there before. And beyond the gate wasn't an alley at all. It was a long, unlit tunnel of fog and trees. Makoto stepped back, instinct screaming to run. But then he saw something inside the tunnel. A woman, bent backward, crawling, a mouth wide open and smiling. Makoto ran. He didn't stop until he reached his apartment, heart pounding, blood roaring in his ears. He slammed the door, locked it 3 times, and turned all the lights on. But on his hallway mirror, someone had written his name in a red smear, one long, curving line forming the shape of lips. Across the city, the others were seeing it too. Yuki had set up a camera facing her apartment window, hoping to catch proof of the strange symbols that kept appearing. But when she reviewed the footage the next day, the entire cityscape outside her window had vanished, replaced by a static field of mouths, open, twitching, whispering. She leaned in, freezing one frame. Every mouth was hers. Some were crying, some were laughing, one was chewing. Kenta tried to ignore it. He blasted music, turned his phone off, refused to look into mirrors. But on the 4th day, he lost his voice entirely. No illness, no pain, just silence. He went to 3 hospitals. None could explain it. His vocal cords were perfect, but at night he could hear himself talking, not from his throat, from inside the walls. The voice said things like, "You left me behind. Now I'll wear your voice." And once, it whispered, "She's inside your lungs." Aika, once the calmest of the 4, had changed completely. She kept her curtains drawn at all times. She no longer answered calls. The charm her grandmother gave her, once a source of comfort, was now burned into her palm like a brand. The paper fused to her skin, blackened and still smoldering faintly. She didn't remember pressing it against her flesh, but the words scrawled across her bedroom wall in a language she had never learned, translated roughly to, "What was silenced must now sing." She began dreaming in voices, not a voice. Hundreds of them, women, children, the elderly, all speaking over one another, their sentences looping, weaving into gibberish, until the only phrase left clear was, "You opened her mouth. By the end of the week, the shrine was no longer hiding. It was spreading. Makoto began photographing the gates, first in Shibuya, then near Shinjuku, then at a subway station that no longer showed up on any map. The images corrupted his phone. Every time he opened the gallery, he saw a new torii gate closer than before, until finally, there was nothing but red. He stopped taking pictures, but the images remained on bus stop ads, graffiti tags, blinking across TVs and store windows. One morning, he found one carved into his car windshield, almost lovingly. They met at an underground cafe on the edge of town, the air stale and dry. Yuki hadn't slept in days. Kenta wore a scarf despite the heat. Aika arrived last, pale and shaking, her hands covered in small mouth-like cuts. "There are more of them," she whispered. "I hear them everywhere, under the floors, in the pipes, even in my own throat." Makoto leaned forward. "It's not just a haunting. It's not her. It's something older. She was the first mouth. We opened her, and now they're crawling through her," Yuki said. "Like a tunnel." "No," Aika corrected. "Like a throat." Silence fell between them. Then Makoto asked the question they'd all been avoiding. "Do you think the shrine was a prison?" Kenta nodded slowly. His eyes were full of fear. He scribbled on a napkin and pushed it forward. It wasn't built to worship her. It was built to contain her. Later that night, all four stood again at the edge of the forest. Only it wasn't a forest anymore. It was a city now. A city of mouths. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of torii gates, glowing faintly in the fog. They twisted out of alleyways, through subway tunnels, down gutters. People walked past them as if they weren't even there. As if some veil had been dropped only for the four of them to see. In the air, the chant had returned. Louder now. Rhythmic. Speak the silence. Feed the voice. Speak the silence. Feed the voice. And then the sound of breathing, not theirs. Heavy, wet, hungry. The shrine was no longer a place. It had become an organ, a mouth, a god trying to speak again after centuries of being sewn shut. And they were the tongue. Chapter 7, Those Who Speak Too Loudly. It began with a missing child, 7 years old, last seen walking home from cram school in Narima. She had been holding a red balloon. The news cycle covered her for a day, 2 at most, before the coverage abruptly stopped. No updates, no leads. Just a vague statement from police claiming she had likely moved abroad with relatives, even though her family denied knowing any relatives overseas. Yuki tried to find the broadcast again that evening, desperate to hear the girl's name, but she couldn't. Every article had been replaced by something else. Advertisements, error messages, blank white screens. Even her own saved link to the video redirected to an empty space. It was as if the girl had never existed, except Yuki still remembered her face and that red balloon. Makoto noticed it next. A colleague named Sato didn't show up for work. It wasn't unusual. People got sick, overslept. But when Makoto mentioned Sato's name during lunch, no one reacted. "Who's Sato?" asked his boss, blinking blankly. "We've never had a Sato." Makoto pulled up a photo on his phone. Sato's smiling face, half-eaten cake, a birthday party in the break room. But when he showed it to the others, their eyes glazed over. "I don't see anyone," someone said. Makoto looked at the photo again. Sato's face was gone. All that remained was the cake. By the end of the week, they'd counted 23 people who had vanished. Friends, neighbors, teachers, strangers in convenience stores. Gone without warning. Gone without memory. Only the 4 of them remembered, and even that was becoming difficult. Names slipped away like mist. Faces blurred in photos. Voices erased from voicemails, replaced with low, crackling static that hissed like exhaled breath. The shrine was feeding, and Tokyo was beginning to forget itself. Kenta broke down first. He stood in front of a bathroom mirror, tracing the outlines of his lips with a razor blade. Not deep, just enough to see if his mouth was real. He'd stopped sleeping, afraid that the next time he closed his eyes, someone else would wake up in his body. Sometimes he would stare into his reflection for hours, convinced that his mouth was moving slightly out of sync. One night, he heard a voice inside his jaw, behind his teeth. It said, "Thank you for carrying me." The next morning, he was gone. They searched for him everywhere. His apartment was untouched. His phone sat charging, still playing a loop of Buddhist chants he had downloaded weeks ago. There was no sign of struggle, only a note on his kitchen table. "I'm not gone. I'm inside. She's using me now. Please don't remember my name. If you say it aloud, she'll know where you are." Aika read the note twice, then ripped it in half and burned the pieces in the sink. Makoto didn't speak for the rest of the night. Yuki began recording everything: audio logs, handwritten journals, physical photographs. Every morning, she'd wake up and find one page missing, one tape blank, one name erased. The world was shrinking. Entire blocks of the city seemed subtly different. A convenience store was now a construction site. A once busy train line no longer stopped at its usual station. People stared through her on the streets, their mouths slightly ajar, as if waiting for someone to speak into them. She called her mother. A stranger answered. "This number is no longer in service," the woman said. "But you answered it," Yuki said. A pause. Then the voice whispered, "So did she." Click. The 3 remaining friends met again, huddled in the back of an abandoned bookstore in Kichijoji. Shelves half-toppled, dust thick in the air, every book now blank. "This isn't a curse anymore," Aika said. "It's evolution. She's learning how to survive in the city." Makoto's hands trembled. "We should have never spoken her name. We woke her up, and now she's replacing us." "Replacing us with what?" Yukai asked. Aika looked down at her phone. There were only 3 contacts left. Makoto, Yuki, red mouth. Her hand dropped the phone. Outside, the wind howled, but it wasn't the wind. It was breathing. It rose over rooftops, through alleyways, beneath sewer grates. It pulsed like a heartbeat made of whispers, like lungs the size of a city. From the mouth of Tokyo, something was crawling out. As they left the bookstore, Makoto paused in front of a shattered bus shelter. Behind the broken glass, a poster was peeling. It had no images, only a phrase in red ink, scrawled like lipstick across the surface. "Your voice belongs to her now." Chapter 8. The Woman with No Mouth. The city was changing, not in the obvious way. No, Tokyo still buzzed with its usual rhythm, but something deep within the streets, within the alleys, was shifting. The air felt heavier, thicker, charged with an undercurrent of fear that no one seemed able to name. It was as though the ground was trembling beneath the weight of something that had been buried for too long. Makoto, Yuki, and Aika stood in front of a crumbling building in Asakusa, one of the oldest districts of Tokyo. Their breath rose in clouds in the cold evening air. In the distance, the faint glow of a shrine's torii gate flickered. No one else was around, the narrow streets silent, except for the occasional scuttling of rats across broken pavement. They hadn't spoken for hours, consumed by the gnawing feeling that they were running out of time. "I can feel her," Aika whispered, her eyes wide with a frantic intensity. "We're close. We've come too far to stop now." Makoto glanced at her, then back at the building before them. It looked like an abandoned temple, though it hadn't been a shrine for centuries. Vines had overtaken the stone steps, and the main doors were sealed shut with rusted iron bars. But something about this place, about the heavy, oppressive silence that surrounded it, made Makoto's skin crawl. Yuki pulled out a crumpled map she had found in a library's archives the previous week, a map detailing the old city districts, the forgotten landmarks. She traced her finger across the page, stopping at a spot marked in faded ink. "There's a hidden chamber beneath the temple," she said, her voice trembling. "According to this, it's where she was kept." Aika took a deep breath. That's where it all started. Before the shrine, before the curse. She stared at the door for a moment, as if gathering her strength. Then, without another word, she stepped forward, pushing against a rotting wood. It creaked and groaned but gave way, revealing a narrow stairwell that spiraled downward into darkness. They descended into the depths, the air growing colder with each step. Their footsteps echoed off the damp walls, and Makoto couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them. The staircase seemed to go on forever. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the bottom. The chamber was small, only about 15 feet across, and there, in the center of the room, stood an altar. It was crudely made, constructed from stones that had long since eroded with age. And on the altar, bound in chains, lay a statue. But this was no ordinary statue. The figure was a woman, her face contorted in agony. Her mouth, however, was unnervingly absent, an empty void where her lips should have been. The eyes were wide open, filled with a hollow, haunting expression that seemed to pierce into their souls. "She is the one," Yuki whispered, stepping closer. "The woman who was silenced, the one they locked away." Makoto's heart began to race. He couldn't look away from the statue. The emptiness of the woman's face, the lack of a mouth, felt like it was calling to him, urging him to understand. "She was once a prophet," Aika said softly, "a woman who could speak the future. But her words were too dangerous. Her prophecies were too powerful, too true. People feared her ability to see into the future, so they did what they always do with power they can't control. They sealed her away." Yuki stepped forward, running her fingers along the cold stone altar. But they didn't just silence her, they erased her from history. They destroyed every record, every trace of her existence, until only this shrine remained as a remnant of her curse. Aika turned to face them. Her eyes were filled with both terror and awe. "But when we found the shrine, when we spoke her name, we freed her," Makoto finished for her. The words hung heavy in the air. "And now she's using us to speak again. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in. The temperature dropped sharply, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, writhe, as though something were alive within them. Suddenly, the woman's eyes blinked. The three of them froze. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breath, shallow and quick, as if their lungs were unwilling to take in the air. Then the figure on the altar began to move. Her hands twitched first, then her head. Slowly, agonizingly, she began to rise, the chains rattling as she lifted herself from the stone. Her body was hollow, like a shell. Her limbs were skeletal, covered in cracked, ashen skin. And her face still had no mouth. But then it opened. A horrific, gaping maw split open along her neck, revealing rows of jagged teeth that seemed to extend into an endless cavern. Her voice, if it could be called that, was not a scream, but a wretched, strangled whisper. "You freed me." The walls trembled as her voice echoed throughout the chamber. The very air seemed to vibrate with her words. Yuki took a step back, her hand clutching the edge of the altar for support. This isn't right. We've made a mistake." The woman's head snapped toward them, her eyes locking onto theirs. There was no malice there, only an insatiable hunger. "You cannot undo what has been done," she said, her voice low and chilling. "I will speak again, and all will listen." Suddenly, the air turned thick with a damp, suffocating fog, and the temperature plummeted to near freezing. The shadows began to stretch, twisting into shapes that were vaguely human, but not quite. Faces, hundreds of them, emerged from the walls, each one silently mouthing words, their lips stretching unnaturally wide. "Her curse is waking," Aika whispered. "She's no longer the woman of silence. She is now the voice of the forgotten." The altar beneath the woman began to crack, the stones groaning under her weight. And then, all at once, the figure lunged forward, her arms outstretched, the void of her mouth growing larger, wider, like an abyss ready to consume everything in its path. Makoto stumbled backward, his heart racing. "We have to stop her," he shouted. But it was too late. The woman's scream filled the chamber, reverberating through the very bones of the city. And with that sound came a terrible realization. They hadn't just freed her. They had released the mouth of Tokyo. Chapter 9. Echoes of Silence. The woman's scream reverberated through the chamber like the cry of a tortured soul, echoing off the walls and vibrating in the very marrow of their bones. It was a scream that held no true sound, only an oppressive weight, as though the world itself were holding its breath. And with that sound came an undeniable certainty. They had made an irreversible mistake. The altar cracked beneath the weight of the woman's fury, the stone grinding and splintering like the breaking of a century-old curse. Her empty mouth stretched wide, revealing an impossible darkness that seemed to devour the air itself. A dark fog poured from the cracks in her form, and the room began to distort, the walls warping and breathing with an unseen pulse. The floor beneath their feet began to tremble, shaking violently, as though the earth itself was alive. "No, no, no, no," Yuki screamed, stumbling backward, her feet sliding across the wet stone floor. She reached for Aika, her hand grasping the air, but the darkness between them was thickening, pulling them apart. Aika's face was pale, her lips trembling as she stepped back toward the door, as though she could flee from the nightmare they had unleashed. "We have to get out. We have to." But The words died in her throat as the woman's voice rose again. Not a scream, but a low, guttural hum, like 100 voices speaking in unison, whispering in languages that no one should ever hear. The city is listening. The words were like acid, burning through their thoughts, twisting their minds. You cannot escape. You have awakened me, and now you will hear me. The shadows in the room stretched and surged, reaching for them like grasping hands, pulling at their limbs. Makoto could feel them, thick and cold, wrapping around his arms, dragging him into the dark. His heart pounded in his chest, and the air around him grew thick with the suffocating weight of something ancient, something malevolent. "No!" he screamed, trying to break free, but the shadows pulled tighter, squeezing until his chest constricted and his breath caught in his throat. He could see Aika and Yuki struggling, but they too were trapped in the same dark mass. The woman's form hovered over them, her mouth still gaping wide, and the sound that emerged from her was not just a voice anymore. It was the voice of the city itself, of everything they had ever known, everything they had ever loved. The buildings, the streets, the trains, the people, all of them were part of her now, feeding her, listening to her. "You cannot escape the mouth of Tokyo," she whispered, her voice slithering into their minds. Every word, every sound, every thought, they belong to me now. The room began to fold in on itself, the walls twisting, reshaping, as if the space itself were being consumed by her presence. The floor cracked, and Yuki fell to her knees, gasping for air. The shadows around her grew, expanding, turning into dark, twisted faces that hissed with hunger. Makoto's vision blurred as the oppressive weight of the dark fog began to suffocate him. He could no longer hear the sound of his own breath. All that filled his ears was a low, monotonous hum, like the drone of 1,000 voices, blending into one unholy chorus. His thoughts were growing fuzzy, distant, as if they were being pulled away from him, lost to the void. Aika, on the other side of the room, was clutching her head, her eyes wide with terror. She was speaking, but no sound came from her mouth. Her lips moved in frantic desperation, as if trying to form words, but the words were stolen from her the moment they left her lips. And then, in the midst of the chaos, something flickered in Makoto's mind. Something familiar, something old, a memory buried deep within him began to resurface. He remembered the stories his grandmother used to tell him as a child, the legends of Tokyo's earliest days, of an ancient curse that had been locked away beneath the city's foundations. The curse of the woman with no mouth, the one who could speak into the hearts of the living, stealing their voices, their thoughts, their very souls. But there was one thing his grandmother had said that echoed through his mind now more than ever. Silence is the true power of the mouth. When it speaks, it consumes everything. "We're feeding her," Makoto whispered, his voice a rasping echo in the oppressive silence. "She's growing stronger. She's feeding off us, off our voices, our fear. And if we let her speak, she will devour the city. She will devour everything." Yuki's eyes widened as the words sank in. She nodded frantically, her face pale. "We have to stop her," she choked out, her voice barely audible. "We have to silence her before it's too late." But the woman was already laughing, the sound echoing like the crackling of bones. Her empty mouth twisted into a grotesque, gaping smile. "It's too late," she said, The city is mine now. The silence is mine. And once the silence is complete, nothing will remain but me. Suddenly, the shadows surged forward, crawling over them like living things, pressing against their skin, their bodies, their souls. Makoto gasped, his lungs burning as the air grew thin. The fog thickened, and the voices, countless voices, rose in a cacophony of whispers, each one a thread in the vast web of the curse. They were trapped. There was no escape. But in the darkness, there was a flicker, a faint, fleeting spark of light. Yuki's hand shot out, reaching for the altar, where the statue of the woman with no mouth still loomed, her hollow gaze fixed on them. Makoto watched as she placed her fingers against the stone, murmuring something under her breath. Words she could not remember, but felt deep in her soul. It was a prayer from a time long forgotten. The woman's eyes locked onto Yuki's with terrifying intensity. Her mouth opened wider, revealing a cavern of darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly. But Yuki didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She pressed her palm against the altar, and for a brief moment, everything froze. Then there was a crack, a deep, bone-shaking crack. The stone shattered, sending fragments flying across the room. The woman screamed, a sound so terrible that it rattled the very foundations of the earth. And then, in a rush of light and sound, everything went silent. The shadows receded, the fog lifted, and the oppressive pressure in the air disappeared. For a moment, there was only silence, pure, unbroken silence. Makoto, Yuki, and Aika stood frozen, their breath returning to them, their bodies trembling with the aftershocks of the nightmare. But in that silence, they knew one thing. It wasn't over. The woman with no mouth had been silenced, but her curse had not been broken. And Tokyo was still listening. Chapter 10. The Sound of Despair. The silence didn't last long. It began subtly, so subtly that at first none of them noticed. A soft humming, barely audible, like the distant whirring of electricity or the low murmur of wind moving through hollow steel. It was Aika who heard it first. She froze, her body stiffening as her eyes widened in horror. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Makoto turned to her, his ears straining. "Hear what?" Aika didn't answer. She just stared, eyes distant, as if listening to something deep underground. Then, suddenly, she clutched her head and screamed. The sound of her voice tore through the chamber like a blade, sharp and raw. It echoed far too long, as if the walls themselves were mimicking her, playing it back like an old recording stuck on a loop. Yuki rushed to her, grabbing her shoulders, but Aika kept screaming over and over until her voice cracked into a choked sob. Makoto looked up. The statue was gone. The altar was shattered. The chamber, once ancient and still, was now alive, breathing, shifting. Something had changed. The silence had not been victory. It had been transformation. They had silenced the mouth of the woman, but not her voice. It was in the city now. They emerged from the tunnels at dawn. Shibuya was eerily quiet, a ghost of itself. No honking cars, no morning rush, no chatter, just the mechanical hum of a metropolis waiting for its cue. The three of them walked the empty streets in stunned silence, passing open convenience stores with no clerks, crossing intersections where the lights changed, but no one moved. Makoto checked his phone. No signal, no messages, no notifications. He glanced at Yuki. "Something's wrong." Yuki nodded slowly. "It's like the city's forgotten how to speak." Then they saw it. Posters, On every wall, every bus stop, every LED screen, a face, her face, the woman with no mouth. Only now, she had a mouth, a red, stretched mouth that curved too wide and too sharp, a grin that looked like it had been carved with a knife. The same words were printed below every image in bright blood-red text. "The city is listening," Aika whimpered. "Why does she have a mouth now?" Makoto felt his stomach churn. "Because we gave it to her." They made their way to Aika's apartment, too shaken to go anywhere else. The moment they entered, they felt it, that pressure, the same pressure from the shrine. It was in the walls, in the floor, in the air. Aika's cat, Momo, sat in the corner, staring at them with unblinking eyes. Not blinking once, not moving, not even breathing. Yuki crossed the room and gently picked the cat up. It was stone cold. "She's dead," Yuki said softly, placing the cat back down. "No," Makoto whispered, looking into Momo's glassy eyes. "She's listening." They collapsed into silence again. Aika closed all the windows. Makoto turned on the TV, desperate for any sign of life. Every channel was the same, static, then a faint image of the woman's face. No mouth, just her eyes, staring directly at the viewer. Her eyes seemed to follow them as they moved through the apartment. Then the voice began again. It didn't come from the TV. It came from inside their heads. "You brought me back," it whispered. "You opened the gate, and now the city will never forget." Makoto grabbed his head, the pain stabbing through his skull. The voice was drilling into his thoughts, replacing memories, rewriting them. He could feel them slipping. He couldn't remember his parents' faces. He couldn't remember what his apartment looked like. He couldn't remember if his name was really Makoto. He turned to Yuki. "Tell me something real, something only we would know." Yuki blinked rapidly, struggling. I met you at university. You used to wear that awful red jacket." "I never had a red jacket," he said slowly. Yuki stared at him. "Yes, you did." "No," Makoto said, voice trembling. "That wasn't me. That was someone else." "She's rewriting us," Aika said, rocking back and forth on the couch, her voice barely audible. "The curse, it's not just haunting the city. It is the city now, and it's changing us." They all stared at each other. Who were they now? Makoto stood up and went to the window. Across the street, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Every person he could see, on balconies and windows, in the street, they were all standing perfectly still, staring up at the sky. Their mouths were sealed shut with red thread. One by one, they raised their arms and pointed at the building Makoto stood in. They were all pointing at him. "She knows we're here," he whispered. Suddenly, Aika screamed again. Her mouth was bleeding, thin trails of crimson dripping from the corners of her lips. Makoto rushed to her side. Shai opened her mouth, and there, inside her throat, were fingers. Thin, pale fingers reaching up from the darkness inside her. He yanked her backward, pulling her into his arms as she coughed and gagged, the fingers retreating. Yuki was frozen, her hands shaking violently. "We can't stay here," Makoto said. "She's inside everything now. We have to get out of the city." "No one gets out," Aika said through sobs. "Not anymore. She is Tokyo. The trains, the traffic, the air, the light. She hears every thought, every movement. If we leave, she'll follow." Yuki finally spoke. "There's one place, one thing that might work." Makoto turned to her. My grandmother once told me about a place older than Tokyo, Yuki whispered. Older than the curse. A place the shrine was built to keep sealed. We didn't destroy the curse. We unlocked it. But maybe there's a way to lock it again. Makoto's hands trembled. Where is it? Yuki looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. Under the city, beneath the original foundations, a hidden lair they buried when they built the subway. Aika wiped blood from her chin. Then we go underground again. Makoto looked around the apartment, at the eyes watching from across the street, at the humming that was growing louder in his ears. He knew what had to be done. Then we go now. Chapter 11. The Forgotten Lair. They descended into the city's underbelly just before midnight. Yuki led them through an access tunnel behind a long-abandoned metro station in the Kita ward. A place so far off the grid, it had vanished from official records. The entrance was covered in rusted fencing and overgrown ivy, the smell of mold and decay thick in the air. As they stepped into the blackened shaft, the last bit of Tokyo's polluted moonlight slipped away, swallowed by the shadows that pulsed like breath. Makoto held a flashlight. Its beam flickered, despite fresh batteries. Aika's eyes darted from wall to ceiling, her face pale, streaked with dried blood. Yuki walked with purpose, but even she couldn't hide the tremble in her steps. Where does this tunnel lead? Makoto asked. To the bones of the city, Yuki replied softly. Before Shinjuku, before the emperors, before shrines. The tunnel wasn't built for people. They had to crouch, the concrete pressing down on them like a coffin. Pipes ran along the walls, ancient and hissing, leaking unknown fluids. Faint voices echoed, whispers just outside the range of understanding, words on the edge of a language. Sometimes they sounded like their own voices, but twisted. Do you hear that? Rika whispered. Makoto nodded. It's us. Yuki shone her light on the wall. Faded carvings were etched into the concrete, older than the city, older than writing. Grotesque images of a woman with a wide, bleeding mouth, sacrificial altars, children kneeling in rows. She wasn't worshipped, Yuki said. She was feared. This wasn't a shrine. It was a prison. They reached a collapsed section of the tunnel. Beyond it, the air changed, thicker, heavier. Something ancient was breathing down there, alive, waiting. Makoto cleared rubble with his bare hands, tearing skin on jagged stone. He didn't stop, not until they found the hole, a narrow vertical shaft descending into blackness. No ladder, no light. Yuki peered down. This is it. Aika's voice trembled. How do we know she's not already there? Makoto didn't answer. He just swung the rope they'd brought down into the dark and began his descent. As they lowered themselves one by one, the air grew colder. Their breaths turned to fog. The walls became rougher, raw earth mixed with bones. Human bones. Some crushed, some clawed from the inside. Aika tried not to scream when she saw a child's skull wedged between two slabs of stone. When they reached the bottom, the floor was soft, wet with something thick and warm. The cavern before them was immense, pulsing faintly with a red glow. It wasn't lit by fire. It was lit by flesh, a sickly membrane that coated the walls, like muscle tissue alive and writhing. Veins throbbed across it, pumping blood that wasn't theirs. At the center of the cavern stood an altar, and on it, a box carved from obsidian, sealed with hundreds of red strings, interwoven like a spider's web. And sitting beside it, the woman, not a ghost, not a memory. Her face was pale, impossibly smooth, as if sculpted from porcelain. Her eyes were bottomless wells. Her mouth was no longer gone. It had returned and grown. It stretched from cheek to cheek, lips sewn open with red thread, blood forever leaking from the corners. She did not blink. She did not move, but she was watching. The voice came not from her, but from inside them. "You came back." Makoto stepped forward, heart hammering in his throat. "We didn't mean to free you." "But you did," she whispered through their minds. "And now you must take my place." Yuki's knees buckled. "What? One must stay. The seal was broken by 3. Only blood can restore it. Yours." Makoto looked at the box. It pulsed like a living organ. "She was imprisoned in that," Yuki said. "Not by power, not by rituals, but by sacrifice." Aika stared at her. "You mean someone had to die to lock her away?" Yuki nodded slowly. "Someone who chose it." Silence fell again. The woman on the altar rose. Her body was broken. Her arms bent in unnatural ways, joints clicking as if made of wood. Her long hair dragged behind her like smoke, trailing whispers. She drifted toward them, feet never touching the ground. Makoto raised his flashlight. Her mouth smiled wider. "You cannot escape a voice once you've heard it." Then the cavern began to collapse. The walls shook violently, blood and bones raining from above. The red membrane peeled back, revealing thousands, millions of faces screaming in silence, trapped in the flesh of the city. Men, women, children, all staring, all listening. The woman reached for them. Yuki screamed, grabbed Makoto's arm, and shouted, "Go! I'll do it." "No!" Makoto grabbed her hand. "We stay together." Yuki shoved him. "This is why my grandmother warned me. Why she died with red thread sewn in her lips. She was the last seal. I'm the next." Aika sobbed, grabbing Yuki by the waist. "You'll die." Yuki smiled through tears. "Better me than all of Tokyo." Then she turned and ran toward the altar. As the woman lunged, Yuki leapt into the air and slammed her body into the box. Blood poured from her eyes, ears, and mouth as the red strings wrapped around her like serpents, pulling her inside. The woman screamed, not with her mouth, with the city. Sirens blared, windows shattered, buildings shook, Tokyo wailed in agony. Then, silence, true silence. Makoto and Aika woke hours later at the tunnel's entrance. It was morning. Birds chirped, cars honked. The city was normal. Yuki was gone. And on Makoto's wrist, a single red string, tied in a perfect knot. Chapter 12. The Last Thread. The city had returned to life. People filled the streets again, their laughter and conversations echoing across the neon-lit avenues. Trains hummed along their tracks. Phones buzzed with endless notifications. Tokyo, it seemed, had awoken from a collective nightmare. But Makoto knew better. It hadn't ended. It had only settled. He stood on a rooftop overlooking the Shibuya Scramble crossing, watching the crowds below move like blood through veins. Somewhere down there, people who had stared into the mouthless woman's eyes now lived with no memory of it. The posters were gone. The whispering static had vanished, and yet something in the air still felt wrong, off, as if the city itself was holding its breath. He turned his wrist. The red string remained, tied tightly, unmoving. He'd tried to cut it, burn it, even tear the skin from his wrist. It would not come off. Aika hadn't spoken since that night. She now lived in her family's shrine in the countryside, surrounded by ancient scrolls and salt lines. She didn't answer Makoto's calls, but every now and then he received a letter, never signed, never dated, with only one sentence written in careful ink. She is sleeping beneath the concrete. Makoto started dreaming and read. He would wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, mouth dry, the sheets soaked with sweat, and always he heard her voice, not screaming, not whispering, singing, a lullaby with no language. One morning, he awoke to find his apartment walls marked with deep scratches, as though fingernails had been dragged through the plaster. He lived alone. No pets, no visitors, and yet he swore he could hear footsteps pacing in the hallway at night, always stopping outside his bedroom, never knocking, just waiting. He tried leaving the city once, made it as far as Chiba before his vision blurred and his ears filled with static. He collapsed at a rest stop, blood pouring from his nose. When he opened his eyes, he was back in his apartment, the TV flickering with snow. Her face flickered on screen for a split second, eyes wide, mouth open, silent scream, and then gone. He hadn't tried to leave since. A month passed, then two, until one day, a small envelope appeared at his door. Inside was a single item, a spool of red thread, and a note. When the thread runs out, so does the city. Makoto stared at it for hours. What was he supposed to do? Seal her again? Finish what Yuki started? Or was it a warning that the curse had not been locked away, but passed on from Yuki to him, like a virus, like an inheritance? Later that night, he returned to the place where it had all begun. The shrine was gone. Only a crater remained, deep, black, and pulsing with heat. Construction tape surrounded it, but no workers were present, no machines. The city had simply erased it from memory, but she was still there, watching, waiting. Makoto approached the edge, the red thread in his hand. The ground beneath his feet trembled slightly, just enough to feel like a breath escaping from lungs that were not human. He knelt and tied the thread around a cracked piece of stone. His hands trembled. Then he whispered the same phrase Yuki had murmured before her final act. You may listen, but never speak again. The wind stopped, the air thickened, and deep below he heard her scream. The ground sealed itself with a slow groan, as if a great mouth had been closed again. For now. Makoto stood in silence, alone in a city that would never know what had been buried beneath it. But he knew, and he knew one day the thread would fray, and when it did, she would return. Final words. The red mouth remained sealed, for now. But curses like hers are patient. They sleep in stone, in memory, in concrete. And sometimes they speak through us when we don't even know we're listening. Have you ever heard silence that felt alive? If so, she's already heard you.